Buonasera, good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Verona. On behalf of the Hannah Arendt Center for Political Studies, I welcome you all to this conference, Arendtian Counciliarism, Visions and Care for Democracy. We have hosted a couple of years ago the Arendt Circle, and so we've already experienced the pleasure of the company of Arendtian scholars, and we've also experienced almost the same heat wave 2 years ago. So for those who were here 2 years ago, I think this feels familiar. I had prepared some introductory remarks, but I think I will skip that because I want to give space to our guest tonight. Let me just say briefly that this conference is a conference that was born basically a year ago at Bard College while I was there, invited by Roger Berkowitz, who is here today with us. And I was talking to Shmuel Lederman, our friend, colleague from University of Haifa, and Gabriele Parrino. We were smoking a cigarette and discussing that we should have a conference on Arendt and the councils. And so we started basically a year ago to plan this conference. Unfortunately, Shmuel, who has written a very important book on Arendt and participatory democracy, couldn't leave Israel because of the situation. And so he will not be here with us, but he will be on Zoom on for his presentation on Friday at noon. So the idea of this conference, as I said, was born a year ago at Bard College in New York, but we also realized that we are also commemorating more or less Hannah Arendt's 50th anniversary of her death, which happened in December 1975. But we took the occasion of commemorating her life, her work, exploring a theme that is largely overlooked in the Arendtian political thought. So the proposal of a federal council system. So her vision on this council system is primarily examined in On Revolution, where Arendt's famous comparison between the American and the French revolutions culminates in a celebration of the rare historical appearance of such systems, reflecting her romantic sympathy for it, while also making clear the effort she makes to envision new, local, participatory, and radically democratic institutions. This is what we like to analyze, to address, to tackle today. So by highlighting a political constellation of events ranging from the Athenian city-state and medieval municipalities to the Roman Republic, Thomas Jefferson's townships, the Paris Commune in 1871, Rosa Luxemburg's council communist tradition, the establishment of the Jewish kibbutzim in the early 30s and 40s, concluding with the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the reason why Arendt presents these historical examples to such an extent can be traced to the desire to advocate for a possible rehabilitation of a participatory and radically active democracy, which would correspond with democracy's nature herself. So while Arendt critiques modern representative politics, the council system works as a counter-argument that envisions a democratic body politic grounded on political equality, plurality, and more importantly, on the civic engagement and shared deliberation of the people in the public sphere. So in this context, our conference, or the proposal of the council system, not only puts the entire conceptual framework of Arendt's political thought into a different perspective, but also raises the question of whether this council tradition still operates as an alternative to our current neoliberal scenario. So as Arendt says in On Revolution, these instances of participatory practices, in spite of a tradition that cancels them out, they keep re-emerging. They keep re-emerging with, as Arendt says, with an utmost weird regularity. And so one of the utmost weird regularities in which these participatory practices have appeared is, for me, for us, I guess also for Marci Shore here with me, the Ukrainian Revolution of Euromaidan, which took place 2013, 2014. But we could see many different instances of this reappearance in Georgia, in Belarus before that, in many different places of the post-Soviet space, and not only in that. So this is the reason why we decided to invite for the keynote inauguration lecture of this conference, Marci Shore. She's a professor of intellectual history at the Munk School of Global Affairs of the University of Toronto. I guess you say Munk School, yeah. So as you probably know, she was a professor at Yale, and she left United States a few months ago after a long time decision to leave the United States and transfer to Canada. Her field of research is the history of literary and political engagement with Marxism and phenomenology. I just mentioned here two books that were written before the book, The Ukrainian Night. So the first book is Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918-1968. And it's more or less the biography of Polish and Polish Jewish writers drawn to Marxism in the 20th century. This book was published by Yale University Press, 2006. The other book is The Taste of Ashes, published in 2013, and it's a study of the presence of the communist and Nazi past in today's Eastern Europe. And then last but not least, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, Yale University Press, 2017. And this is how I got to know Marci Shore, by reading this book, by finding by chance this book, which really was a breath of fresh air for me after February 24, 2022. And because I thought this book was so important, I proposed to Italian publisher Castelvecchi to translate this book. And I translated it, and I wrote an introduction, and a young collaborator of mine, Giacomo Mormino, wrote an essay at the end of the book. And the book is there for you for sale if you're interested. And I guess at the end of this conference, Marci can sign copies of the book. So it was an important operation to translate this book and to make clear to at least to the Italian public discourse, that this war had a specific political context, and this war hasn't started 2022, but it started in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, and as a response, as a violent response to the democratic revolution or democratic uprising of Euromaidan. I will not take any more time to Marci's keynote, and I will just mention the title of her keynote tonight. Alles Denken ist Nachdenken. Care for democracy, care for the soul, and the limits of the non-political. Thank you, Marci.
Thank you so much, all of you, for coming on this very hot summer evening, where I'm sure there are other things one could be doing, like sitting by the river and eating ice cream. And thank you so much to Olivia, not only for translating this book, but also for understanding so well what I wanted to say in this book. It's a somewhat quirky book. You know, it's not an academic monograph. it's a book about the experience of revolution, and is very informed by Arendt, and very informed by thinking I've done my whole adult life. And it was so gratifying to read, even, in translation via Deep L, Olivia's introduction, and to feel like she understood so well what I was trying to express. Maybe because this is an Arendt conference, and I'll talk a bit about the Maidan, and I'm going to talk about Arendt and talk about those things together. It's brought me back to my first encounter with Arendt when I was a 19-year-old, at Stanford in 1991. And I still remember like the thrill of encountering Arendt for the first time. She's one of my first loves and most long-lasting loves. I mean, she's one of the thinkers I've gone back to again and again and again, over all this time, who's kind of been with me. And I've been in dialogue with her. She may be dead, but I still feel like I've been in dialogue with her for a long time. And when I teach Arendt now, I look at my students, especially the first-year students who are about to read Arendt for the first time, and I have this moment of jealousy of like that they still have the thrill of this encounter in front of them. And I tell them this story, which I now can't resist opening with, this anecdote about Arendt to get my students excited. And I'm going to tell it because it's also about the book on revolution, which I reread for the first time in years before coming to this conference inspired by Olivia. And in 1997, I was living in Warsaw doing research on a Fulbright. And a friend of mine from undergraduate at Stanford was on doing research on a Fulbright for his own project in the Czech Republic. And I hadn't seen him in several years, but he proposed to come to Warsaw, and visit me, which I thought was great. And so, somebody I was close to as an undergraduate and hadn't seen for several years. And I was waiting for him at the train station. And one could imagine all sorts of things you say when you encounter an old friend you haven't seen for a while. But I get to the train station and he had been up all night on the overnight train from Moravia to Warsaw reading on revolution. And the first thing he said when he got off the train was not, "It's so wonderful to see you," was, "We have to have an Arendt seminar. Can we use your apartment?" I had this tiny little one-room apartment that I was renting in Warsaw, and I barely knew anybody in Warsaw at the time. I had only been there for a couple months. But somehow, miraculously, people came out of the ground, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon, we had a little room full of people for our Arendt seminar, and we only had the one copy of the book. Which this was before the internet. It was before you could just pull up these things on a PDF. We only had the one copy of the book. We had his copy of the book, and we took it to a photocopy shop to make copies for everybody else. And so we were photocopying the copy he had been reading on the train with his margin notes. And some of the margin notes were things like, note Kantian influence or dialogue with Hegel here. But some of the margin notes were things like, "I love you, Hannah," little heart. And I tell this to my students when they're about to encounter Arendt for the first time to put them in the proper frame of mind. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, about the Ukrainian Night, and about our present moment, and about the questions I've been asking myself. One of the things I always tell my students is that, if I had really good answers to these questions, if I knew how to solve all the problems in the world and could resolve the problem of evil and the existence or lack of existence of God, and we could just do that today, and then everyone could go home and go on to something else. But I don't have those solutions. It's constant posing of questions that we pose to ourselves, that we pose to one another, that we go back to time and time again. And so I want to start with this "Alles Denken ist Nachdenken," which is one of Arendt's phrases that I go back to periodically. It doesn't quite perfectly translate into English like many things. You can say all thought is an afterthought. You know, of course, German, and my daughter is here, who's a native German speaker, and you know, she would tell you just how weak my German is, especially in comparison to her German. But one of the things you can do in German is add these prefixes, you know, and suggest things in a way that doesn't quite work in English. So all thought is an afterthought, and it can be read at least two ways. One of which is, you know, Hegel's Owl of Minerva. And I think one of the ways in which Arendt is closest to Hegel, you know, is this sense that you can never really know the meaning of an action in real time, that the actor is never the author of his or her own life story. It's only the historian looking back, you know, because actions not only occasionally, but as a rule, have consequences far in excess of their intent, because of what she calls, in another phrase I love, the boundlessness of human interrelatedness. So this all thought is an afterthought. You can't really know in real time. You can't really know the consequences of what you are doing in real time. But there's a second reading of this that I also go back to, which is the inseparability of thinking as such from experience. You know, and this is something I constantly go back to, in part because I've been immersed for years in phenomenology. I've been struggling with Husserl for years. I'm finishing finally this very long book that has to do with thinkers connected through phenomenology in East Central Europe. The idea that thinking, as intensely abstract as it can be, is never really an abstraction. You know, it always comes back to experience. You know, all of our thought, you know, is coming from experience. And the Ukrainian Night is really a book about the experience of revolution. It's not an abstract analysis, you know, of a definition of revolution. It's not a political analysis of revolution. It doesn't say what was a good idea, what was a bad idea. It doesn't talk about geopolitical, really anything. It's about the experience of revolution. And in fact, the original title, it got started as a long essay, which was a profile of a Ukrainian translator and psychoanalyst named Yurko Prohasko, with some minor characters supporting, which was a long essay that I published in German in 2014. And the title was, you know, a phenomenology of the Ukrainian Revolution, which the German editor did not even blink, you know, from that title. When I showed it to an American editor, he said, "Marci, you may never publish a book with the word phenomenology in the title. Americans do not read books with words like phenomenology in the title. That has to go." So needless to say, the word phenomenology is not in the title, but it was very much conceived as a phenomenology in the sense of revolution as an experience given to subjectivity, you know, an experience given to the eye. And it was very much inspired. This is also Alles Denken is Nachdenken. It was a book I never intended to write. In some ways, I intended specifically not to write about this because as a historian, I never trust myself to write in real time. All the advantages we have as historians come from looking back. You can know things looking back that no actor could know in real time. You know, ideally, if your research is good, you can know not only what A said to B, but maybe what B said to C and what C said to A. And nobody in real time could capture all this. You know how things played out. I never trust myself to write too close to real time at all. I'm in no way an expert on Ukrainian politics. And what captured me and what I couldn't turn away with was this experience my friends and colleagues were having. And it's very much a book about, you know, the experience of my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues. You know, in that sense, it's a very personal book. And in some ways, it's a book about my falling in love with the revolution that was not my own, you know, that I was watching from afar. But I understood, and what captivated me watching this play out was that it I was watching something that was not just a political transformation, but an existential transformation, really at the level of individual human beings. I felt like people were changing in front of me, and people I knew personally. And so it shakes you more when it's people you know personally. I mean, in some sense, the world is always divided much more fundamentally than by nation or race or ethnicity or anything else into people you know personally and people you don't know personally. And when you know people, you know what it would take to push them to a place they had never imagined they would be pushed. And to discover in themselves capacities that they never imagined they had. You know, there was a moment when my friend Ola, who is Polish Ukrainian, who I know from both Warsaw and Ukraine, who was a woman at that time in her 50s, yeah, a philologist, you know, who always dresses in perfectly tailored clothing and wears heels and speaks in a beautiful literary version of all of the many languages that she speaks. The last time before the Maidan I had seen her was at, you know, a literature conference in Washington. We were having breakfast at some very fancy hotel. And when Ola was writing to me, you know, out there in temperatures way below freezing, and she was crushing bricks and building barricades. And I thought, Ola is not the brick crushing barricade building type. I mean, she is no more likely to be out there crushing bricks and building barricades than I would be, which is not likely, you know, at all. And I understood, because I knew her, just how far she had to be pushed in order to get to that point where she felt like this is absolutely what I need to be doing at this moment. And that's what shook me into writing the book. And so that the thinking about revolution I do in that book is really a thinking about what revolution means for subjectivity. You know, and in fact, one of the things that I was led to think about in this book was how the word subjectivity in English is in fact more ambiguous than it is in Slavic languages. In both Polish and Ukrainian and Russian, you can clearly distinguish subjectivity in the sense of something that might be subjective, it might be dependent on opinion, it might be relative, with being a subject as opposed to being an object. It's very clear in Polish. You have podmiotowość and subjektność. But in Russian, you have subjektivność and subjektność. I mean, so you can make this distinction more clearly than you can make it in English. But so what does revolution mean for being a subject as opposed to being an object, for being a responsible agent? The Ukrainians called this revolution the revolution of dignity, which is a term that very much spoke to me because, of course, it's very Kantian. You know, Kant's famous definition, you know, and I think there's a lot of Kant and Arendt we can talk about later, you know, of a human being. Anything that can be replaced with something of equivalent value has a price. Anything that is beyond all price and admits of no equivalent has dignity. Human beings are distinguished, you know, in that we have dignity. From that follows the categorical imperative that we always treat a human being as an ends and never as a means, you know, and that classical Kantian definition, in some sense, to me, so captured what was at stake on the Maidan, you know, what it meant to be a subject as opposed to be an object. So I was interested in these ideas of dignity, of subjectivity, of individuality, you know, and what Arendt would bring in as the categories of spontaneity and natality. Revolution as the giving birth to something new. You know, and this idea of natality, which is something I've clung to in the past 8 years, you know, as somehow an antidote, you know, to all the horror and catastrophe and death, is her idea of the remarkable human capacity to set in motion something new, which you could argue is her countering of Heidegger's emphasis of being towards death, you know, with the moment of birth, you know, both literal and as metaphorical. And then this very Kantian concept of spontaneity, you know, the potential to do something new and unexpected, something that had not been predicted or not been planned, you know, which, reading this essay about the Hungarian Revolution that Olivia sent me, I saw that that was also what so struck her about Hungary in 1956. There were things that were predictable and then things that could not be predicted, you know, and that the idea of spontaneity, unpredictability, natality was for her bound up with human subjectivity and human freedom. And so this aspect of what was at stake on the Maidan particularly captivated me. And so I was looking at 2014 very much from the point of view of being a historian of totalitarianism, being someone who has spent a lot of time in the archives thinking about the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s, and then trying to understand post-totalitarianism, trying to understand what happened in Russia in the 1990s, in the 21st century. And that inflected my understanding of the Maidan. I'm sure I would not understand it that way if I had not been so immersed in the 1930s. And now when I'm doing so much talking about my own country, which I had rarely done before 2016. I spent my whole career really trying to explain Eastern Europe to Americans. And now I find myself in this strange position of trying to explain America to Europeans. My perspective is very much inflected from what I understand about the 1930s and what I understand about what happened in post-communist Russia, and what is similar and what is different. So one of the things that I had long been preoccupied with in Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is her idea of totalitarianism as the destruction of subjectivity. The complete destruction of freedom in a way that previous forms of tyranny had not managed. What was unique? What is she looking at in Nazism and Stalinism that was different from previous forms of tyranny? One of the things she says, and she develops this in Truth and Politics, is that previous, political forms of tyranny had invoked lies. But those lies were like a tear in the fabric of reality. And the careful observer could spot the place where reality had been torn and sewn back together. Whereas in totalitarianism in the mid-20th century, you then get a complete reconstruction of reality in such a way as to be seamless. And one of the things that this complete reconstruction of reality can do is conveniently eliminate all of the contingency that is the actual condition of empirical reality. And so it can make life much more logical. You can have a story that might be a falsehood, but it's much more internally consistent than real life, because real life is just constantly permeated by the contingent, by the irrational, by things that don't make sense. As a historian, this very much spoke to me, because the condition of real life is constantly permeated, by the arbitrary, by chance encounter, by something that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't rained that day and someone hadn't got home for the umbrella, and by people behaving irrationally, in a way that political science often can't account for, because humans will behave irrationally. In any case, she talks about how authority had always been meant to restrict freedom, but totalitarianism aimed at the complete elimination of freedom, which for her was the complete elimination of spontaneity. And for her, this elimination of spontaneity was the destruction of the self. It was the destruction of subjectivity. And she makes then some very controversial claims, about the fact that by the time the Jews were led to the gas chamber, they were already dead. That the self had been killed, that you can kill subjectivity before physical extermination. And she said, I'll read this paragraph. It is more significant that those individually condemned to death very seldom attempted to take one of their executioners with them. There were scarcely any serious revolts. Even in the moment of liberation, there were very few spontaneous massacres of SS men. For to destroy individuality is to destroy spontaneity, man's power to begin something new out of his own resources, something that cannot be explained on the basis of reactions to environments and events. And she goes on to explain how this destruction of spontaneity renders all men superfluous. And she has this very particular definition then of what it means. What is the creation of superfluous people, which is different from the Russian concept of superfluous people in the 19th century intelligentsia, which is Also interesting, but distinct. The idea that people can be rendered superfluous both through statelessness, the kind of the destruction of legal subjectivity, and through atomization and conformity, and the destruction of the self. And then she talks about the radicalization of measures to treat people as if they had never existed and to make them disappear in the literal sense of the word, which again very much speaks to me as a historian of the Soviet experience, because you literally, erase people from photographs. You literally, like, people as if not just that they have been accused and condemned, but as if they never were. They disappear. They're all the famous stories of the great Soviet encyclopedia and entries being pasted over with other things because that person never really existed anymore. So this radical evil that she talks about here is the human subject is destroyed, so murder means nothing. It's like the murder of a gnat. The concentration camps, she said, produce absolutely superfluous people. It's not economically utilitarian. It's designed to destroy the human subject, not exploit labor. Radical evil, she says there, has emerged in connection with a system in which all men have become equally superfluous. And this destruction of subjectivity and the ways in which it's happening in Russia is something I return to again and again and again. We can talk about this later. Like, what is the source of what the writer Volodymyr Rafaenko calls the anthropological catastrophe that is Russia? It is clearly a crisis of subjectivity. And my two brilliant philosopher friends in Kiev, Volodymyr Yermolenko and Tatiana Olgarkova, wrote a wonderful essay called Crime Without Punishment and Punishment Without Crime. And they say that there are two categories of people in Russia. There are these Übermenschen, people who are untouchable, who can commit any egregious, horrific crime, and no one will ever be held accountable. They are beyond all accountability. And then the masses of people who are infinitely vulnerable and can at any moment be done away with for no reason at all. Under this notion of arbitrariness, this word they have in Russian, proizvol, an arbitrariness that is always already tinged with tyranny, with potential terror. It is a way in which you atomize people. And the interesting thing, about these two categories of people, the people who are infinitely vulnerable and the people who have no accountability, is that in neither case do you have a responsible subject. In neither case do you have a subject taking responsibility for any action. That speaks to these kind of two sides of the crisis of subjectivity in Russia. In any case, if the question in some sense in this book is that if the death of spontaneity is the destruction of the individual, does that mean that the rediscovery of spontaneity is the birth of the individual? And the Maidan was about this rediscovery of spontaneity. And one of the key words, and a word that does translate, was self-organization. This potential for self-organization that had not been necessarily previously known, but had clearly been brewing latently, didn't come from nowhere, but exploded, at a certain point. So is the rediscovery of spontaneity the birth of the individual, this element of the unexpected in the revolution? On November 21st, 2013, when it was mostly students, mostly young people, who go out to the Maidan to protest Ukrainian then President Yanukovych's declining at the 11th hour to sign this association agreement with the European Union. The association agreement with the European Union was something that was of enormous importance to a very particular demographic. If you were young, if you were upwardly mobile, if you were thinking about starting university, if you knew people abroad, whether or not Europe would be open to you meant everything. If you were 15 or 20 or 25, if you were already retired, and didn't have language skills and weren't thinking of going anywhere anyway, it was less important. So for the students, the stakes were enormous. Were they going to be able to go on Erasmus exchanges? Were they going to get a chance to learn foreign languages? Could they do internships abroad? Was the world going to be open to them or not? They were the ones who went out on the square. Nobody was thinking then, we're going to die here. It was more of a kind of carnival, like, they held hands, they sang, they played music. The slogan was Ukraine is Europe. And then on November 30th at 4 a.m., Yanukovych, under pressure from Putin, sends his thugs, his riot police, Berkut, the Siloviki, these men of strength they talk about in the Russian language, to brutally beat up the students. And it seems to me that the wager was the parents are going to freak out and they're going to pull their kids off the streets, because that kind of large scale violence had not previously been used by the government against the whole population. And that was when something totally unexpected happened. Because suddenly, 24, 36 hours later, you went from having several hundred, maybe 2,000 people on the square in the center of Kiev to having over 500,000 people in the center of Kiev. No one had ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev, because instead of the parents pulling the kids off the streets, the parents joined them there. And then they're not just shouting, Ukraine is Europe. Then the slogan is, we will not permit you to beat our children. And that was an explosion that nobody had expected. And once it was there, it was transformative. And people were out there screaming, we will not permit you to beat our children, even who didn't have children themselves. And suddenly you had generations going together to the Maidan, and it turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The violence and the repression increased throughout the winter. By the second half of January, and I was just watching this stream from Vienna, I wasn't even there, but you could still feel it almost palpably, that something had turned and a critical mass of people had decided that they were willing to die there if need be. And that was not true in November, and it was true by the end of January. You had a critical mass of people that had been radically transformed. And that was simply an extraordinary thing to watch. And so what I wanted to get at, and what Olivia understood so well, is the way in which for Arendt, freedom and subjectivity are bound up with natality and spontaneity, which was at the very center of that story about the revolution. That freedom has to embrace the unexpected, the way that empirical truth has to embrace the contingent. Arendt says the vulnerability that empirical truth will always have to political lies is its original contingency. There is no law of physics that said that Germany had to invade Belgium in 1914. You can always imagine a world in which that's very unlikely to have happened. And empirical truth always bears the vulnerability of its original contingency. That's its vulnerability and its freedom. And it's the impossibility of knowing what's going to come out of it all. Natality, this capacity to set something new in motion, despite the fact that you can never possibly know what's going to come out of it all, is for her the miracle that saves the world, that can potentially save the world. And this is what I saw in the Maidan, and this is what I wanted to capture. So the Maidan for me was it was a moment of extraordinary hope. It's a moment I have clung to since then, this revolution that was not my own. And it was a revolution. It was a revelation of the human capacity for courage, for generosity, for solidarity, for things people didn't necessarily expect from themselves, until that moment. You need a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear at the same time. It's a miracle that ever happens, but once in a while it does, and the revelation of that capacity is extraordinarily inspiring. So this book was an exploration of the experience of revolution, where it comes from, how it feels, what it means. Arendt describes this as the lost treasure, of revolution, something that is beyond victory or defeat. And I was often criticized for calling the Maidan a revolution, saying, but there's been so many defeats, and I kept going back to Arendt. There's a treasure of revolution that is beyond victory or defeat, that is inherent in this experience. This experience of creating what she says, that public space between people where freedom can appear. At every meal that we eat together, she writes, freedom is she's quoting somebody here, freedom is invited to sit down The chair remains vacant, but the place is set. That possibility for freedom to appear before people. And so Ukrainian Night was a thinking about revolution together with my Ukrainian friends. It was a preoccupation with subjectivity and with what it means to find things in oneself that one didn't expect. The other idea I kept going back to is what time meant for revolution, because one of the things people kept telling me was, oh, it was very strange, but I lost track of time. Like, did this happen an hour ago? Did it happen yesterday? Did it happen last week? And person after person kept saying, it was very strange. I had this experience of losing track of time, and the border between night and day became effaced. Suddenly you could call anyone at any hour of the day. There was no such distinction anymore. And so I became very interested in this notion of the present. What is the present? Which, of course, traditionally philosophers struggle with this idea of the present because you can't grasp it. It has no duration. As soon as you try to catch hold of it, it's already past. And so I subjected my poor students to reading Bergson, to reading Husserl, to reading Heidegger, to reading Sartre, to trying to understand what the present is. I talked to my physicist brother-in-law, and he said, well, Marci, in physics, we talk about time equals zero, but it's purely a theoretical construct. Really, the present does not exist. There is really no such thing. But what captured me was Sartre's idea of the present as that border, the border between the en soi and the pour soi, the in itself and the for itself, facticity and transcendence, between what has happened and who you have been up to this moment, and then the possibility of going beyond, the possibility of something new. And that is our present at every moment of our lives, but it's rarely illuminated. We're rarely shaken into experiencing it. And the Maidan was a moment where people were shaken into experiencing the present as that moment of the border between facticity and transcendence, where you have the possibility of starting something new. So those ideas really stuck in my mind. Now we're at a moment of thinking about war. And I've struggled with then how to reconcile. What does it mean to move from thinking about revolution to thinking about war? And what does it mean to think about evil? And so I spent a lot of time thinking with Arendt about revolution, and now I'm spending a lot of time thinking about evil. Where does evil come from, and what does evil mean? There's that moment in Arendt's famous interview with Günter Gauss in 1964, where she says, what was decisive for me was not 1933. What was decisive for me was 1943. That was when we learned about Auschwitz. It was the moment when we learned about Auschwitz. She said, at first we didn't believe it. Before that, we said, well, one has enemies. It's entirely natural. Why shouldn't people have enemies? But this was different. It was as if an abyss had opened. And this was what Karl Jaspers called the Grenzsituation, another thing I can't get in English, this kind of, this limit situation, this border situation, where all of our reason and concepts break down, where we're pushed to some point of extremity. And that, for Jaspers, is what pushes us to philosophy. It's precisely that border of what we can understand. So now the question for me has been, how do we think human freedom, human spontaneity, and human evil together? And I'll just talk about that for a few minutes now. In early April 2022, the Ukrainian journalist Natalia Gumanyuk, who, if you haven't followed her, you should all follow her. She is really one of the great women of the 21st century. She's extraordinarily courageous. She's been on the front lines and doing a lot of mind-blowing war crimes research and a lot of travel. To all through the global South, trying to build these bridges. She posted in early April 2022 that she was visiting a village close to Bucha, outside of Kiev, and she was visiting the home of her best friend, which had been ransacked by Russian soldiers during the invasion of the month before, when it was occupied. Mercifully, her friends were not there at the time, which is how they survived. But the house was ransacked, and they stole things like a PlayStation and computer equipment. And they tore up, actually, they cut up a copy of the Ukrainian translation of Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I thought someday when a great novel is written about this gruesome war, it is going to open with that anecdote of the Russian soldiers having destroyed this copy of Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I was later visiting that same mutual friend of ours in her house outside of Bucha, which is now no longer occupied, and she showed me the book. She showed me the book with like the knife tears through it. I don't know what the Russian soldiers were thinking as they chopped up Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. I now, just a few weeks ago, I was in Kiev at the Kiev Book Arsenal, and Volodya Yermolenko wanted to do a public discussion, and this was his topic. He's like, we're going to do a public discussion on Hannah Arendt and the problem of evil. You know, and we're going to talk about Eichmann in Jerusalem, and is evil really banal? And it was, we had this talk, it was just a few weeks ago, maybe it was even June 1st, and it was brunch time. It was like right around lunchtime on a Sunday, and there had been an unusually long air raid. Yeah, I spent the whole night, up till an hour before that talk, in a bomb shelter. It took a long time for the all clear to be issued and for everyone to be able to come out of the bomb shelter. And then I ran over to the Kiev Book Arsenal, and Volodya was there first, and we sat down to talk about Hannah Arendt and the problem of evil. And that room was just packed with people. There were hundreds of people there, who had not slept the night before, but who were there hanging on every word to try to understand the problem of evil. And, which is one of the reasons why Kiev is so extraordinarily compelling, at the moment, because there's a sense of, it's not an abstract theoretical question. It's a question that people are living in their own skin every day. And one of the things, maybe we could talk about this more, that Volodya and I were talking about, are these different manifestations of evil. Like, can we understand, we can't really understand Eichmann the way we understand Putin, but what about the Russian soldiers? Can we understand them the way Arendt understood Eichmann? What about these people like Trump, for whom there's just a total moral nihilism? There are no values, there are no first principles, there's no concern for anyone else, there's just nothing. But what about these other people, like Olivia and I were talking yesterday, like Lindsey Graham or Marco Rubio, who know who know they've made a pact with evil, who know they've crossed over to the dark side? How do you understand those kind of Faustian bargains? How do you how about the Russian soldiers who are thoughtlessly following orders? They don't even know why they're there. They don't, and they are carrying out the most gruesome atrocities. They are tying people to boards and electrocuting them. They're raping women prisoners and children. I mean, they're doing things that, why? How do we understand why they're doing what they're doing? How do we understand why they're burying children, under rubble day after day after day? How do we disentangle the apathy from the narcissism, from the conformity, from the opportunism, from the thoughtlessness, from the sadism? I've now become very interested in the problem of sadism. One thing that you hear from Russians who are not Russian soldiers, but who are in Russia when asked about the war, and this goes back to the latter part of the talk that I'm about to get to, is there's a refrain, "Nie interesuюсь политикой." I'm not interested in politics. I stay out of politics. I'm not interested in politics. In some ways, I'm not very interested in politics either. Like, I would prefer to stay in the realm of literature and philosophy, but there are moments when does the political realm become a moral realm? When is it no longer appropriate to say, when is it a moral failure to say, I'm not interested in politics, when there's mass atrocity being carried out? Is that still political, or have certain kinds of quantitative changes become qualitative? Let me talk a little bit now about Denken, about thinking, and thoughtlessness. Of course, I'm very defensive of Arendt, and that she was hated for that Eichmann book. In some ways, I'm coming from the East Coast of the United States. New York intellectual life has never recovered from the fissures produced by that book. They're still there. She was hated for that book, in part because of what she said about the Judenrat, but largely because it was read as an attempt to exculpate Eichmann, say he wasn't so bad after all, which I think was a profound misunderstanding. I think for Arendt, the fact that Eichmann failed to think didn't make him better, than other criminals. In some sense, that was the greatest crime, the failure to think. There was never an excuse for the failure to think. That the longer one listened to him, she writes, the more obvious it became his inability to speak was closely connected to an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of anybody else. And I was very sympathetic to her feeling that, obviously it's more emotionally satisfying for us to demonize evil, but we have to look it in the eye. And looking at it in the eye means looking also, at this banality, and that the shoddiness, what she calls to Samuel Grafton, the shoddiness of these ideals. She says that like what we can't bear, what all of us cannot cope with about the recent past is not the number of victims, but the shabbiness of these mass murderers lacking any sense of guilt and the mindless shoddiness of their so-called ideals. And this moral imperative of thinking, the moral imperative to think, which she then develops in Life of the Mind, that it's not stupidity, it's thoughtlessness. Might the problem of good and evil be connected with thought? There's something about the activity of thinking as such that could be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing or actually condition them against it, which is very close to, for instance, what another philosopher very close to, Jan Patočka, who's also long dead, and who at the end of his life was very close to Arendt's work. It's very close to what he calls care for the soul in his kind of Neoplatonic revival of this idea of care for the soul. The care for the soul is daring to ask the philosophical questions, daring to pursue truth, even if it's not a reified object we can ever hold in our hands. But caring for the soul is pushing ourselves to pursue that truth. I think that's very close to what Arendt is talking about here as a moral imperative to think. It's a kind of care for the soul, which for her, I think her idea of caring for democracy is the kind of caring for the soul. You have to think. Let me also say a couple words about Europe here. Ukraine for me is the moment, one of the reasons it's so seductive to go there is it's a moment of the most intensive thinking, precisely in that Arendtian sense, and not because, I think Ukrainians are genetically better able to think than other people, but they are going through particular experiences, alles Denken ist Nachdenken, that are pushing that thought forward in a very intense way. One of the things that Olivia said in her introduction that I think is important is that there was something racist in the dismissal of the Maidan, as if it must have been some kind of American-sponsored coup because these people couldn't possibly be capable of acting independently. And the assumption that people can't possibly be capable of acting independently, that condescension. One, I know as an American, it was not an American coup. Like, on the contrary, Americans were embarrassingly uninterested. My Ukrainian friends were desperately hoping for more signs of solidarity. And it's not that Americans were negative or Obama was negative. Our attention was elsewhere. We were not focused on that. It was not an American coup, but also this sense of condescension that people could not possibly be capable of acting independently, which is so close to the way the Russian soldiers responded to all the resistance they faced in February and March and April of 2022. And people like post-Soviet grandparents came out to scream in Russian to the Russian soldiers to go home. You're not wanted there. And the Russian soldiers were like, who is paying you? Which oligarch are you working for? And they just couldn't, they honestly couldn't believe that people had self-organized. That people had spontaneously come out to resist because they did not want to be occupied. The assumption was anyone engaging in any kind of engagement must be paid by someone. There must be some puppeteer pulling the strings. The other thing that Olivia said that I want to mention because it's stuck in my mind, said the democratic West, forgetting, as Arendt would say, its own origins, looks the other way, almost as if it were jealous of a revolutionary paternity that it is unwilling to concede to others. And this idea of jealousy, which I hadn't thought of before, but now really stuck in my mind, the West being jealous of this revolutionary paternity, which it's lost in itself and is very close. But Vasyl Cherepanin, who is another kind of brilliant Ukrainian intellectual, said the Maidan was too European for the EU. You know, it was a return to something that was the essence of European values that had been forgotten. Yeah, which feels very on point to me. The other friends of mine who are like who work in with the Russian opposition said that the Russian opposition watched the Maidan and then watched Belarus, which is another fascinating story about self-organization in 2020, also with jealousy. You could arguably Masha Gessen's whole book, The Future is History, of why were we not able to do in Russia in 2011 and 2012 what they were able to do on the Maidan. You know, that sense of jealousy, not in not wanting it to have happened, but that why couldn't we do it too? You know, and when I talked to another kind of brilliant sociologist friend, Anna Shorchunovskaya in Vienna at the time of the Belarusian revolution, she said, my Russian friends are so jealous. You know, the Russian opposition is so, like, that's what they want. You know, they want these people spontaneously on the streets. Okay, let me just say a couple things then in conclusion, this care for democracy and care for the soul, that for Arendt, care for democracy, it feels very much like Patočka's kind of Neoplatonic return to care for the soul. You know, you have to have enough of a sense of human dignity and subjectivity to push yourself to ask the questions. And for me, one of the things that was interesting about Arendt's thought was that she combines three levels. The level of the singular, the level of the universal, and this third mediating level, which is a level I think about a lot as a historian. As philosophers tend to move from the singular to the universal. And historians tend to move along that third mediating level. You know, we like to look at class or race or ethnicity or nation or religion or generation or something that is a mediating category between the singular and the universal. For Arendt, politics plays the role to some sense of that mediating third level. You know, and there are very few thinkers who can function that well across all those levels. I mean, I look at her intense, the intense, in some ways, solitude of you must think from the I. The imperative is to think from the I, to think independently. And that Eichmann book is all about thinking from the I. But it's also, in some ways, you know, like in Husserlian terms, a thinking to a universal essence. Can you get from thinking from the I about a very concrete particular to the extraction of a universal essence? And then she also has this robust thinking of politics as this mediating third term. In her essay about Karl Jasper, she writes that philosophy may conceive of the earth as the homeland of mankind, you know, and of one unwritten law, eternal and valid for all. Politics deals with men in the plural, not just a singular mankind. Let me read you one more quote from The Gap Between Past and Future, which is an essay I love. And she says, if one were to write the intellectual history of our century in the form of a biography of a single person, aiming at no more than a metaphorical approximation to what actually happened in the minds of men, this person's mind would stand revealed as having been forced to turn full circle, not once, but twice. First, when he escaped from thought into action, and then again when action, or rather having acted, forced him back into thought, whereby it would be of some relevance to notice that the appeal to thought arose in that odd in-between period, which sometimes inserts itself into historical time when not only the later historians, but the actors and witnesses, the living themselves, becoming aware of an interval in time, which is altogether determined by things that are no longer and things that are not yet. In history, these intervals have shown themselves more than once that they may contain the moment of truth. And this is where I kind of feel Ukraine is now, in that space between things that are no longer and things that are not yet. You know, having been forced from thought into action and then from action back into thought. And in that interval where something is no longer, but we don't yet know what is that, where the most intense thinking is taking place. That is my hope. You know, my hope is that somehow that kernel of thinking can be a kind of avant-garde or an inspiration, not least of which to my own country, which I am watching with despair and contra spero, some kind of hope. And let me just leave you with one more quote, because I tried to set a rule of never ending lectures on a note of despair, which I have a tendency to do. So I have to force myself to say something hopeful in the end. So let me read you one more Arendt quote. It says, "Under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lessons of the country to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. Humanly speaking, no more is required and no more can reasonably ask for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marci, for this wonderful talk, for the many things that you said and you reflected upon, not only from your book, but also regarding the present situation. I think that one of the most interesting things that you said was this idea of the spontaneity and a rediscovery of spontaneity. So the crisis of a subjectivity, as you explained in Russia, this idea of arbitrariness, of Proizvol, which is very present in your book, and exactly the opposite. So the experience of the revolution as a discovery of one's own subjectivity. And it's all rooted in a spontaneity, which is, it's interesting. I mean, the way you put it is this spontaneity is something that it's just there, it's given, it can be activated or not. And I think this is very, at least for me, politically and philosophically very interesting. But okay, just to leave the floor for questions. We have maybe 20 minutes altogether before we move to our reception, that it will be at 7, if the people will remain. But please, for those who want to ask questions, the floor is open, and we have a microphone, moving microphone. Takes a while.
Yep, thank you for the wonderful talk. I would like to ask you a little bit about the thing that you said about the Maidan being too European for the EU, because I think it touches on something that is something that Arendt talks about with regards to the councils, namely that it's the council system breaks with the nation state system for her. And so it seems to me, at first listening to you, I thought it might be counterintuitive to describe the Ukrainian struggle as akin to the council struggle, because the Ukrainian struggle, it seems to me, or at least before listening to you, it seemed to me, is more like the anti-colonial revolts of the 20th century. It's a national liberation struggle. It's done in the name of national sovereignty. It's done in the name of defending a territory. It's attached to a nation state and its rights in the international legal domain. The council system in Arendt is doing none of those things. It's breaking with that nation state system, and she offers it as an alternative. And so I would just like to invite you to sort of speak a little bit more about maybe things that we need to disentangle within the Ukrainian struggle, I'm thinking now, that maybe there is a part of the Ukrainian struggle that was present in the Euromaidan movement that was federalist and non-sovereign and maybe post-sovereign in the way that Arendt speaks about with regards to the councils. And then there's another part of the Ukrainian struggle that, and this is in no way to dismiss it, but it's operating in a different logic, in the logic of a national liberation struggle. And I just would like you to push you a little bit on this point, because I think it's an important aspect with regards to the councils and the specificity of it. Thank you.
No, it's definitely the case that, it's not fitting perfectly, into the consular models by no means. There was a lot of improvisation on the Maidan. In some sense, it's a very different situation now, because now there is a functioning government, and there are things coming from the top, in the name of, there was not at the time. I mean, the government, you were revolting against the government. And Natalia Gumanyuk said early in this, she said, this is the first time in Ukrainian history that there's actually been some kind of alliance between civil society and the government. Like, this is an unprecedented situation. Not that everybody loves the government, but there's a sense that basically the government is on our side, and which was not the case during the Maidan. And there were a lot of improvisational, spontaneous, everything was, whether you were on the kitchen team or the medical team or the, screening of films team, or the storming of buildings team, they were all these different initiatives that were coming together in a very eclectic, in improvisational way. But Ilya Kaminsky said recently, with very much in the spirit of what Vasil had said, is Ukraine right now is more European than Europe is, and Ukrainians are living European values in their very bodies, whereas America has already forgotten why it exists. I mean, Ilya is a very interesting figure. I mean, he's a poet first and foremost. Yes, he's a deaf poet. He's a Jew from Odessa who left as a teenager, writes mostly in English, translates a lot from Russia and Ukrainian, and keeps and has been going back, and working with children in Odessa during the war and running poetry workshops for them. And he was in Kiev with us a few weeks ago. He said, Ukraine right now is more Europe than Europe is. One of the things that the Europe that came to be at stake on the Maidan, again, to put this in Husserlian terms, was much less the empirical, actual existing EU. I mean, this is how it started, with a very practical EU association agreement. It wasn't a fantastic agreement. I'm not an expert on these legal agreements, but it was a foot in the door. It was a sign that potentially someday Europe might be open to Ukraine. The possibility of visa-free travel was huge. Especially for young people. I say young people, not nodding. It's especially for young people. It came to be about something that I would say was more of what Husserl would call the eidetic idea of the universal, almost Platonic essence of Europe. Europe as the rule of law, as a respect for human rights, as the opposite of proizvol, as the opposite of this tyranny and arbitrariness, as it meant being treated as a subject, not an object. This was not the highly imperfect, often hypocritical, actually existing European Union, entangled in bureaucracy and often not knowing what to do when things don't go its way, or you get, Putin lovers like Orban in power in Hungary. But it was about, can you get to this purity of values? Can you get to respect for human rights in a kind of idealistic way that Ukrainians feel that Europe has forgotten about?
If I can just follow up to answer that question, it's interesting that it's like when you play tennis. When you play with a bad player, you play worse. It's always like that. It's a law of tennis. So at the same time, I think the situation we're discussing here, trying to put it within the boundaries of federal council system or nation state sovereignty. So if the idea was to join the EU, which in theory should be a federal system, in theory. There was an attempt that Ukraine, like Georgia or other places, have started. But the grammar of the nation state, or the grammar of the nation, came back through war. That's how war repolarizes, renationalizes, possibly new experiments. Because one of the things that I learned, not only from Marci's book, but from the many books that I read on Ukraine after that, is that it was a totally plural movement where you had Jews, Armenians. Apparently, the first person who started with a Facebook post was an Afghan journalist, and so the idea that Ukraine, or that fight was a nationalist fight, I dismiss that because it has become nationalist because of the war, but it's nationalist in a very particular sense, which is what some experts call the civic nationalism, nationalism of the citizens that live in Ukraine, in spite of their national identity in terms of ethnic. So I guess that what is interesting, or what we would like to highlight of this experience in Arendtian terms, is the fact that you see another instance, another attempt at doing politics differently. And the attempt is, of course, at the beginning always spontaneous, joyful, self-organized, and wonderful. Then something comes in to suffocate that. Of course, that cannot last forever, but that is also a very interesting Arendtian issue, the stability and the permanence of the council system. This is what we will discuss in the next days. But what is interesting, what I try to do in this introduction, and I'm trying to think through, is how many bad tennis players there are out there that want to worsen your attempts and make you as bad as they are. So this idea of reconstructing the nation, or insisting with war to apparently defend some ethnic dimensions of Russophone people. And the other interesting thing I was thinking about, but this is just a thought that comes to my mind, since Marci has spoken so much about revolution, I was noticing how in these horrible days when we witness war after war and endless exercise of violence, of state violence everywhere, I noticed this, that the language has changed. People in the public discourse, at least in Italy, but also in the United States, from what I can read, now the word is regime change. So the regime change is neoliberal word for revolution. Why don't you call it revolution? Why do you call it regime change? As if regime change would be something more, neutral or sanitized, because people are unable to think in terms of revolution, in terms of something that comes from the power of the people. It's just, regime change is another, how do you say, una puntata, another episode of this great risico, which is geopolitics, Adriana.
Just a short contribution to the issue. In my opinion, it's very important to distinguish what Hannah Arendt called the process of liberation and the experience of freedom. I'm not an expert on the history of Ukraine, but I read your book, And my impression is that in your book, what is extremely Arendtian and extremely interesting for me is not the description, your description of what happening in order Ukraine to fight for her national freedom or the intrusion of the Russian power. What is interesting is that you describe this experience of freedom, the taste for freedom. She says the taste of for freedom. This is the lost treasure. It is not what you are fighting for, but the experience you have while through what you are fighting for.
Oh, that's a great point, right? Because for Arendt, that liberation, there's something negative about it, right? You're being liberated from something, you know, but then the sustaining of the experience of free, and it's very interesting that you brought that up, because one of the things about the Maidan was that it wasn't just a revolution, it was also what the Czechs called a parallel polis. Yeah, it was, that was something that the Czech dissidents had theorized and I had forgotten about until the Maidan. It was the creation of a whole parallel society on that square that went on for a few months. And precisely there, where people were living according to the way they wanted to see their society living. So in this kind of microcosm, in this, and it's significant for those of you who haven't been to the Maidan in Kiev, it matters in this case that even by European standards, it's a very big square. It's a complex and geographical space. There are different levels to it. There's an underground shopping mall. Some places are higher, some are low. There's a lot that can be done with that space. And they set up kitchens and they set up medical aid stations. They set up an open university. And so people were actually living there, and that was when they talked about their experience of freedom. They were living the way they wanted to see that, right. And it's like, having had that experience, there was a sense of there's no going back. Now that I have had that experience, I will no longer be content without that.
Yep. Any other? See?
Let me not ask a question, but just to add an illustration to what Marci just said, because I was on Maidan in those months, and there was one very touching detail. So in the middle of the square, there was a huge Christmas tree, the metallic thing that was to be decorated. And actually, the police motivated one of the attacks by the need to decorate the Christmas tree. So you had to smash people in order to make it decorated. So what the crowd did, they covered everything with political banners and graffitis and so on. But nearby, there was a tiny fir tree, the real one, that was decorated with glass Christmas toys that people brought from their house. And you have to imagine a dark and very cold square, all people crowded around, and that space was like somebody's home outside. And those toys were so fragile, but people were there to defend them. So that was the perfect expression of what we were living in those months. And there was a striking contrast with the darkness that reigned in the camp that Yanukovych organized for his supporters, who were brought there in exchange of money, and they were really bored and sitting there like kind of dark kingdom opposed to the kingdom of light, although we were both on in a very brief distance in two separate squares. So there was the world and the anti-world just nearby. It was like a visual expression of political ideas that were, how to say, living inside the souls of people who went out. And I was there with two friends who were Buddhists. They were both of Russian origin, born and raised in Crimea, making meditation every day and eating only salad, and they were there. Like the opposed of violent people, they were there every time after the meditation session. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Anche lei.
Maybe I'll stand because I can't can't see you. Well, thank you for your talk and lots of really interesting reflections. I've read the book, and someone else always picks up on different themes than what I would focus on as well. But I guess I've been left reflecting on one of the last things you had said around how thought leads to the action that happens, which then leads to the next phase of thought of like, well, what do we actually want next? And I'm not an expert on Ukrainian politics and Maidan. I've only followed through the news and so on. But I guess thinking back to when I had read on revolution, I think one of the things that I found really interesting was how she really pulled out the fact that the point about freedom that was just mentioned, but also that it was really just such a radical transformation into a completely new type of system that hadn't existed. And this is where I ask maybe to be corrected in my own understanding, but I feel like what happened after the Maidan revolution was in some ways a going back to a former constitution. Like, I'm not sure what really radically changed in the system of government, in the form of politics. Like, parts of the book that also resonated and I found interesting on revolution was also like Hannah Arendt's critique of political parties as oligarchic institutions. And I think a lot of the sort of oligarchic problems and corruption and things that were still somewhat problematic in the Ukrainian system pervaded, even though there was a new ruler, there was a return to another system which could be called more democratic than before, but there wasn't really a radical shift in power or in systems. So just kind of also thinking about, I guess maybe people are asking themselves in a current situation, what might also change and be next and so on. Are we just defending let's go back to what we had? Or I don't know, I guess I don't have a fully articulated question there. These are some of the thoughts that have been in my head since your talk, but I'd be curious what you think about some of those strains of ideas. Thank you.
Can I just correct briefly? Can I just, if we are here among Arendtian scholars, the American Revolution that she praises more than the French Revolution was successful because it basically instituted what already existed before. That is the townships and the experience of freedom. So I wouldn't agree with you that for Arendt revolution is a radically different system, or that is the way in which revolution is usually understood. Of course, if you move from a monarchy to a republic, it's a radical shift. But the point she makes with the American Revolution is that it was successful because it constitutionalized an experience that was already there, which was not for the French Revolution. But sorry, this was just my professor of political philosophy. But
oh, well, I think some of the Ukrainians here who actually lived through that period could comment much more precisely that it was definitely not all happily ever after the Maidan. Now, you can't do a control study on real life. And what happens is, there's Radek Sikorski, that then as now a Polish foreign minister, goes over to Kiev, tries to help broker a ceasefire. Yanukovych provisionally agrees to stop the massacre on the Maidan, the bloodiest days in February 2022, and to hold early elections. The protesters on the Maidan don't want to agree. Radek, in his very Radek-like way, says, listen, I'm from communist Poland. In 1981, we underestimated the strength of the regime and we got martial law and mass detentions. Like, you take this now and then later you ask for more. Otherwise, you're going to get the army, you're going to get martial law, you will all be dead. And so they agree, but there's a sense of rage. And there's just been this massacre. They've just seen like 100 of their people killed in this sniper massacre. There's this rage at Yanukovych. They're carrying the dead through the Maidan. And within a day or two, Yanukovych flees across the border into Russia. So you've got this vacuum of power, right? Like there's no, a dictator has left, and nobody, like there's kind of an interim government, there's somebody acting as president, but nobody's had a chance to hold elections. And then you have a Russian invasion of Crimea, and then you have this instigation of so-called separatist rebellions throughout the eastern part of the country. So nobody has a chance to catch their breath. And nobody knows what's happening and no one really knows in the beginning exactly who, you have these outbreaks of violence, especially in the East. And people are trying to figure out wait, are these local thugs? Are they guys who are paid? Are they Kremlin agents? Are they Russian volunteers? Are they some kind of motley crew of combination of these different forces? But so suddenly, without having a chance to catch your breath, you've got this war going on. Ukraine is in no position to, their army's being crowdfunded on the internet. When I went over, I'm not very brave. I did not go to where there's an actual war going on, but I went to then Dnipropetrovsk, which was fairly close to the front, to talk to people who were going back and forth. And it was civil society doing the prisoner exchanges. It was all civil society. It was all volunteers. It was all improvisation again, because there wasn't really a functioning state to be carrying out at that point this war. And then you still have layer upon layer of corruption, which was not a secret. This is Zelensky's whole, political entrance came from the serial that he created and starred in, whereupon he was playing Vasya, who is this 30-something history teacher who inadvertently becomes president. And he's earnest and he's smart in a kind of bookish way, but he has no political experience. He gets into the presidency. He is just bewildered by the layer upon layer of corruption. It's like peeling an onion. You peel away one layer, there's another one. You peel that layer, there's another one. And at a loss as to what to do, because everyone is in the service of some oligarch. He hires his old friends from high school, who also have no political experience, but at least he can trust them. So nobody was confronting in some sense in a more visual, and public way, the absurdity of this layer upon layer of corruption in post-Maidan Ukraine is Zelensky. And this is a country that was struggling with this. And they were making progress, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but they were making progress, but it's not like everyone was living happily ever after and they had a beautifully functioning political system with, perfectly, perfect democratic actors. It was really an uphill battle. One of my American graduate students who did his MA, who was American, not at all of Ukrainian origin, but spoke Ukrainian, did a Slavic studies degree. He was hired by the mayor's office to head up anti-corruption programming because he really was not in the service of any oligarch. He was just this American graduate student who showed up with language skills. He was very smart, but had no connections to anyone whatsoever. And when I saw him in Kiev, he's just like, Marci, I spent 6 months just trying to get rid of corruption on the parking meters in one district of Kiev. It's just, you're banging your head against the wall. So it's not like it was, an ideal situation. But that said, there had been a sense that we aren't going to tolerate mass brutality, and there was this generation of students who came of age on the Maidan who started to go into politics. And so there was a sense of a generational change coming, which was hopeful. And again, we don't know what would have happened, had there not been the Russian invasion of Crimea, had there not been this war in the Donbass. So suddenly you've got not only 15,000 people killed in the Donbass, but you have between 1.5 million and 2 million internally displaced persons. Which of course put enormous amounts of strain on the rest of the country and generated all kinds of resentment. And then the question, what about all the people in the Donbass who were too old to flee, or who couldn't flee, or who didn't have the resources? How were those people going to get their pensions? Well, in order to get their pensions, you had to cross into Ukrainian controlled territory, which was ridiculously difficult to do, especially if you were an elderly person. So it's not like Ukraine was a perfect country and everything was going swimmingly. That said, when I was working on this piece for the Wall Street Journal in the 10 days before February 24th, 2022, when everyone was watching the Russian buildup of troops along the border. And the Wall Street Journal asked me to write something, and the editor kept saying, so is he going to invade? Is Putin going to invade? And I kept saying, like, listen, that it is such a vertical system. That decision is in the mind of one man. And I have no privileged epistemological access to what's going on in his head. And the editor said, okay, but you are sure if Russia invades, the Ukrainians will fight? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And she said, how do you know? I said, I just know. And it's not that I had some privileged access to information that other people didn't have. I mean, if you went to Kiev, like on a layover flight and just went out to dinner and to a concert and flew away 3 hours later, you would know enough about Kiev to know that no one wanted to see the Russian army there. You know, not the people who prefer to speak Russian, not the people who prefer to speak Ukrainian, not the people who love Pushkin. No one wanted to see the Russian army there. They were a country struggling to get out of kleptocratic oligarchy. Nobody wanted to submit to this neo-totalitarianism and brutality in Russia, no matter how much they might love Russian literature or ballet or anything else. It wasn't about that. You know, they were working really hard. It was not a perfect situation. Nobody wanted Russian occupation.
I think it's 7 o'clock, so we have to stop. We have to stop. Well, thank you again very much, Marci. And for those who are attending our conference, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:30 when we all start. It's this same building, but the floor, one floor up from here. Should I say something else? Oh, sorry, there are books. The book, it's in Italian, it's my translation, but it's Marci's book, and Marci is willing to sign copies. Sì, ma al reception non mica vengono tutti, saranno 100 persone. No, la reception glielo dico.